Hello from Toronto. My name is John Kyo and welcome to the Future of Food 10 by 10 academic series. In this series, I talk to 10 professors for 10 minutes to get their views on what's happening in the food industry and also what they're working on. And today I'm delighted in episode 7 to have with me Professor Jill Hobbs from the University of Saskatchewan. Good morning, Jill.
Morning, John.
And now you're over in the UK on sabbatical, I believe.
That's correct, yes.
Wonderful. Well, Jill, I'd like to get into it straight away and ask you in 1 minute or less if you could give us a quick overview of who you are and also your institution.
Yeah, my name is Jill Hobbs. I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. As you said, I'm currently on sabbatical in the UK at Bournemouth University at the Business School. But my home institution, the University of Saskatchewan, is a leader in applied research related to agriculture, food and resource issues. In terms of my own background, I'm trained as an agricultural economist and I work across 3 areas. A lot of my work focuses on consumer behavior, how consumers make decisions in food markets, the organization of food supply chains and supply chain relationships, information flows along the supply chains. And then lastly, related to that, food policy. So that would be, for example, labeling policies, policies around traceability, food safety standards, that type of thing.
Wonderful. And from your perspective, Jill, what do you see as the key issues that the food industry is dealing with today in Canada? And are you working on any one of those specific issues?
Yeah, I think that increasingly we see consumers wanting to know more about their food, where their food comes from, how it was produced, different types of food attributes. Some consumers are interested in animal welfare or environmental sustainability, organics, local, and so forth. And increasingly what that means is we have to think about how we signal information about those attributes to consumers. What's the role for quality signaling, verification, and labels? Who does consumers trust for different types of quality verification? Sort of unpacking consumer trust is something that we've looked at. I think what comes across in a lot of that research is that consumers are highly heterogeneous in the sense that some of this matters a lot to some consumers. They're really motivated about these issues. They really want it to be certified. For others, that's less of an issue, and that creates, I think, a challenge both for the food industry in thinking about who are my consumers, how do I communicate to them, and also for policymakers, what's the appropriate policy intervention, if any, here on the labeling front. And then lastly, we've also looked a lot about sort of how the food industry and the agricultural sector communicate to consumers about agricultural production or novel food technologies, like gene editing, nanotechnology. So what's some of the role for narratives in communicating that information to consumers?
Oh, that's very interesting. And in the area of communicating with consumers, as you mentioned, the industry will signal, and they signal, of course, to reduce that information asymmetry with consumers. And they're trying to be more transparent to consumers. Is that working today? Are they being effective?
To some extent, I think it varies. I mean, certainly we're seeing recognition that consumers want to know more about their food, and we're seeing some initiatives as I think examples of industry-wide initiatives. The beef industry in Canada will be one example where you've got groupings coming together across the representatives of producers, processors, and so forth, to come up with a way to verify and signal their sustainability production practices and so forth. So that's an example of an industry-wide initiative. Or we see private standards retailers saying, if you want to supply me, you have to follow these particular production protocols, and then signaling that to their consumers. So I think some of that works fairly well. In other cases, we see high-profile cases where that's collapsed, or we've got food fraud issues where products have been mislabeled, and that hits the media, and people get sort of concerned about whether the food they're consuming is what the label says. So a bit of a mixed bag, but I think it's certainly improving.
Oh, wonderful. And you mentioned about narrative. Can you explain a little bit more about your work in that area, and what does that really mean?
Yeah, so in that particular work, we are interested into how do consumers respond to new food technologies. Gene editing would be a good example. And in the past, it's been the idea as well, sort of knowledge deficit model. We just have to give more information to consumers. Just once they all understand the technology, they'll accept it. I think we've increasingly realized that may not be true. It's how we communicate that's important. So in our work, we looked at communicating about this complicated technology through a narrative, a story. So as a journalist, in journalistic style, telling a story about this particular technology versus more of a logical scientific discourse, the way we tend to have government scientists talk to consumers. What was more effective? We found, generally speaking, the narrative was more effective at reducing unease about that technology than sort of logical scientific discourse. But again, that heterogeneity point is important. Different consumers responded quite differently to that information, and interestingly sought out different types of information. But that's what that work was about.
So you find that the narrative basically is simplifying the complexity and helping to get the message across. Now, if I look to the extension of technology out to using mobile apps to consumers, are mobile apps working? Are they effective? Are websites effective?
Again, I think for some types of consumers that they're very effective. I think probably younger consumers are using more of those types of apps. Again, it comes down to this: the technology's there in terms of developing these types of or providing this kind of information, but whether it's economically feasible to provide it, I think it often becomes the question. So we have the potential for the apps, but in order to provide the information to that app, you've got to have the supply chain structures in place, gather all that information, and provide it up through the chain. So.
I know you've also researched traceability systems, and as an economist, you're looking at the transaction cost involved in deployment of those. Have we done enough in Canada to ensure we have effective traceability in place to be able to do that food safety recall?
Yeah, I think you raise an important point. When I talk about traceability, I like to sort of tease apart what we really mean by it. So on the one hand, there's, as you allude to, traceability is really important if we have a food safety problem, animal health problem. We need to trace back very quickly, and we've certainly been some initiatives, particularly on the livestock side, to make sure we've got livestock traceability and so forth. I think that's not progressed forward as strongly into the food side of things. But the other important role for traceability, I think, comes back to what I started with, is it also a role for it to provide a way to provide credible quality verifications to consumers? And that's a really different function. That if consumers want to know the food was produced in a certain way, that's different than a food safety issue. The food safety issue is important, but traceability can maybe play a role there as well. So I think we see different incentives there. A firm might have a strong incentive to put in place a traceability system to provide a verification about, I don't know, animal welfare or organics from the private market perspective.
And do you think new technologies like blockchain and AI could play a role to facilitate that information sharing and that verification of transactions from the different parties that are doing the certification in the supply chain?
Yeah, certainly. I think we're seeing lots of technological advances, as you allude to, that help us move in that direction. Again, it comes back to what's, at the end of the day, economically feasible for the firms in that food supply chain. But I mean, as the technology gets cheaper, that becomes more important. But I think we're sort of seeing things move in that direction. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, I think.
And we have a new scenario playing out here in Canada with cannabis, of course, and cannabis traceability and edibles. What are you seeing in that market, and what do they need to do to ensure they have proper traceability and the ability to recall?
Yeah, that's a fascinating, I think, new industry being set up and with lots of challenge. It's regulated at different points, or different parts of government have responsibility for regulating it differently. In terms of setting up these new supply chain relationships, that creates transaction costs. But certainly, I think that's going to be an important issue. How you trace things back if there's a problem, how you provide proper information to consumers about these products is going to be really quite challenging. But again, within that restrictive regulatory environment, there's not a lot you can put on a label for obvious reasons. So, but let me create some challenges back for the firms in that industry. How do they communicate to consumers about the types of qualities that they're producing in that industry?
Of course, it all goes back to transaction costs and what does this cost and what are the benefits that are being delivered. Jill, the time goes very fast. In the last 20 seconds, if you're up in front of 50 new scholars, as you regularly are, they're starting their journey in academia, what guidance would you give them?
I'd say never lose the curiosity. The research is all about asking good questions. We're applied researchers where we're working on real world issues. So keep asking the good questions and find a topic that you're really passionate about.
Wonderful. Well, there you have it, folks. Straight from University of Saskatchewan, Professor Jill Hobbs, who's currently on sabbatical in Bournemouth University in the UK. And Jill, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us this morning.
Thank you very much.